My name is Abigail Carter, 31 years old, sitting at our family Christmas dinner in our sprawling North Carolina estate. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, illuminating fake smiles and hidden agendas. Dad stood up, glass raised, and announced, "Abigail, you're disinherited, effective immediately." My siblings erupted in celebration, exchanging high fives across the table. I calmly sipped my wine, letting the expensive Cabernet linger before responding. "Check your bank account, Dad." He pulled out his phone. His face went white when he saw the balance was zero. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family betrayals that end with unexpected justice. The Carter family had always been synonymous with wealth and success in our community. My father, William Carter, built an empire in commercial real estate development from almost nothing. A self-made millionaire with an ego to match, he ruled our family like a CEO rather than a father. Business always came first, and emotions were considered weaknesses. His imposing 6.3 frame and perpetually stern expression made even seasoned executives nervous. Dad never hid his preference for my brother James, grooming him from childhood to take over the family business despite his obvious shortcomings. My mother, Margaret, was the heart of our family. Elegant and kind, she balanced my father's harshness with gentle understanding. She came from old money but valued character over wealth. While Dad pushed us toward business and achievement, Mom taught us compassion and integrity. Her smile could light up a room, and her advice always came with a warm hug. 5 years ago, breast cancer took her from us after a brief but brutal battle. Without her moderating influence, Dad became even more controlling and cold. James, my 35-year-old brother, was Dad's golden child and designated heir. Appointed as company director straight out of business school, he swaggered through life with unearned confidence. With Dad's protection, his numerous mistakes were always covered up or blamed on others. James married Lauren, a former pageant queen who cared more about social status than genuine connection. Together, they lived in a mansion just 3 miles from the family estate, with their 2 perfectly groomed children, who were rarely seen without their nanny. Isabel, my 33-year-old sister, perfected the art of manipulation. Beautiful and charming when it served her purpose, she married for money rather than love 3 times and counting. Each divorce left her wealthier than before. She constantly demanded financial help from Dad for her extravagant lifestyle, from her Charleston penthouse to her collection of designer handbags. Isabel had never worked a day in her life and considered it beneath her. Then there was Ethan, my 26-year-old brother and the baby of the family, spoiled. Beyond reason, he drifted through life on Dad's allowance, which somehow always disappeared into gambling debts, luxury cars, and wild parties. Despite multiple stints in rehab, Ethan never seemed to learn any lasting lessons. Dad always bailed him out, blaming bad influences rather than holding Ethan accountable. And me, I was the black sheep, the one who dared to think independently and forge my own path. After graduating summa cum laude in finance from Duke University, I turned down Dad's offer to work at the family company. Instead, I built my career at a top investment firm in Atlanta, climbing the ladder through hard work rather than nepotism. My success only seemed to irritate my father, who viewed my independence as rejection. Mom was the only one who truly supported my choices. She would call me privately, proud of my achievements, even as Dad diminished them at family gatherings. "Your authenticity is your strength, Abigail," she would tell me. "Never compromise who you are for anyone's approval." After she passed, I found myself increasingly isolated from the family, invited to events only out of obligation. Despite the distance, I kept tabs on the family business. Finance was my expertise after all, and something about the company's recent acquisitions and partnerships didn't add up. 6 months ago, while home for Dad's birthday, I noticed concerning discrepancies in some financial reports left in his study. When I tried to discuss them, Dad dismissed me instantly. "Stick to your little job in the city, Abigail," he scoffed. "Leave the real business to James and me." James smirked from across the room. "Not everyone understands high-level strategy, Dad. Abigail's always been too caught up in details." Isabel chimed in. "Maybe if you spent more time with family instead of trying to prove yourself, you'd understand how things work here." Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "Why are you always such a buzzkill, sis?" Their words stung, but what hurt more was realizing they were actively shutting me out of something important. That weekend, I overheard James and Isabel whispering about offshore accounts and restructuring plans. When they noticed me nearby, they abruptly changed the subject. On my way out, Dad pulled me aside. "Family loyalty comes first, Abigail. Remember that." His words sounded more like a threat than fatherly advice. The coldness in his eyes made me realize something was seriously wrong. Back in Atlanta, I couldn't shake my concerns. I began researching the company more thoroughly, using my finance connections to gather information. What I discovered was deeply troubling. The Carter Real Estate Group was making unusual transactions, partnerships with obscure companies that seemed to exist only on paper, and substantial sums were moving through a complex web of accounts. I called Dad to express my concerns one last time. "Dad, I think someone might be manipulating the company finances. I'm worried about what I'm seeing." His response was immediate and harsh. "You've always been jealous of your brother's position. This is a new low. Even for you, trying to undermine him with baseless accusations. Stay out of family business." The line went dead before I could respond. That night, I made a decision. If they wouldn't listen to my warnings, I would need to dig deeper and find concrete evidence, not just for my sake, but for the legacy my mother believed in and the company that employed hundreds of people. Little did I know then how deep the corruption went, or how it would all come to a head at our Christmas dinner. The discovery that changed everything happened by pure chance. One evening, while working late, I received an email from James that was clearly meant for someone else. He had accidentally included me in a group correspondence, probably because our email addresses were similar. Before I could even process what I was reading, another message from him followed. "Disregard previous email, sent to wrong Abigail." But it was too late. I had already seen the contents, and what I read made my blood run cold. The email discussed moving substantial sums from company accounts through a series of shell corporations. There were references to accounts in the Bahamas and plans to sell company assets to a competitor at deliberately undervalued prices. Most disturbing of all was the casual mention of Dad being kept in the dark about certain transactions. My first instinct was to call Dad immediately, but our last conversation stopped me. He wouldn't believe me without solid evidence, especially against his golden boy. I needed more information before coming forward. I hired Nathan Brooks, a private investigator with experience in financial fraud. A former FBI agent with piercing eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, Nathan took my concerns seriously from our first meeting. "Family businesses can be particularly vulnerable to this kind of exploitation," he explained. "The trust factor often leads to fewer checks and balances." Over the next several weeks, Nathan uncovered alarming evidence. James had been systematically moving company money into personal accounts disguised as business investments. Isabel had leveraged company assets as collateral for personal loans totaling millions. And Ethan had been embezzling funds to cover gambling debts exceeding $700,000. "They've been careful," Nathan explained, showing me his findings. "These transactions are structured to appear legitimate at first glance, but when you follow the money, the pattern becomes clear. The most shocking revelation was that they had manipulated Dad into signing documents he hadn't fully reviewed, taking advantage of his trust and growing forgetfulness. They had effectively gained control of significant company assets without his informed consent. What about legal recourse? I asked Nathan. Complicated, he admitted. Your father's signatures are on these documents, even if obtained through deception. We need more evidence of deliberate fraud. I remembered Charles Mitchell, our family lawyer, who had worked with my parents for decades. Though primarily loyal to my father, Charles had always been kind to me and had a special fondness for my mother. If anyone knew the legal structures of our family businesses, it would be him. Approaching Charles required caution. If he was involved in my siblings' schemes, my investigation would be exposed. I arranged to meet him for lunch under the pretense of seeking advice about my own estate planning. Charles was in his 70s now, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat perpetually halfway down his nose. We met at a quiet restaurant in Raleigh where he ordered his usual scotch on the rocks despite the early hour. After some careful conversation, I took a chance and confided in him. Charles, I've discovered some concerning financial activities involving James, Isabel, and Ethan. I believe they're misappropriating company funds and misleading Dad. Charles's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex. He studied me carefully before speaking. Your mother always said you were the one with both the brains and the heart. He leaned forward. Abigail, there are things you need to know. To my astonishment, Charles revealed that my mother had anticipated potential problems after her death. Margaret was perceptive. She observed behaviors in your siblings that concerned her deeply. Before her illness progressed, she made certain arrangements. Charles explained that my mother had created a separate trust in my name, containing significant company shares and assets that my siblings and even my father didn't know about. More importantly, she had included specific conditions in her will that had never been properly disclosed to me. Your father was devastated after her death, Charles explained. He refused to discuss certain provisions of her will, particularly those that gave you more control than he was comfortable with. I've been waiting for the right time to approach you directly. Charles opened his briefcase and handed me a sealed envelope. Your mother left this for you with instructions to deliver it if I ever felt the company was at risk. I believe that time has come. Inside was a letter written in my mother's elegant handwriting, along with documents detailing her concerns and instructions. She had created a fail-safe mechanism, placing 30% of company shares in a protected trust with me as beneficiary. Most crucially, these shares included special voting rights that could, under certain circumstances, override majority decisions. Did Dad know about this? I asked, stunned by the revelation. He knew some of it, Charles admitted, but I don't believe he fully understood the implications. Margaret structured it in a way that wouldn't activate unless necessary. The letter from my mother brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Abigail, she wrote, if you're reading this, Charles has determined that the safeguards I put in place are needed. I've watched your siblings develop patterns of behavior that alarm me deeply. Your father refuses to see it, blinded by his own expectations and biases. I trust you to protect what we've built, not out of greed, but out of responsibility to our employees and our legacy. You have always had the strength to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Use the enclosed information wisely. Charles provided access to records that confirmed my worst suspicions and added new concerns. The company was being hollowed out from within, its assets stripped, and its future compromised by my siblings' actions. There's one more thing, Charles said hesitantly. Your mother kept a personal diary. She instructed me to tell you about it only if absolutely necessary. It's hidden in the family house, in her old reading room. Behind the third panel of the window seat, there's a small compartment. The combination is your birthday. The next time Dad was away on business, I made an excuse to visit the family home. Finding a moment alone, I slipped into Mom's reading room, a place largely untouched since her death. Following Charles's instructions, I located the hidden compartment and entered the combination, 0612. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a flash drive. The journal contained my mother's observations and concerns dating back 15 years. She had documented instances of James taking credit for others' work, Isabel's manipulation of Dad for money, and Ethan's escalating irresponsibility. She also noted Dad's blindness to their faults and his unfair treatment of me. Most valuable were her detailed notes about company accounts, passwords, and contingency plans. Mom had been far more involved in the business than any of us realized, often working behind the scenes to correct problems my father wouldn't acknowledge. The flash drive contained financial records, emails, and legal documents that Mom had preserved, seemingly anticipating a time when they might be needed. Among them was evidence that James had previously attempted to divert company funds, but had been quietly stopped by Mom working with trusted executives. "Trust your instincts, Abigail," she had written in her final entry, dated just weeks before her death. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do. Remember that sometimes saving someone means standing up to them, not giving them what they want." Armed with this new information and the legal leverage my mother had provided, I began to formulate a plan. The annual Christmas dinner, when the entire family would be gathered together, seemed like the perfect opportunity to address the situation. I had 6 weeks to prepare for a confrontation that would change our family forever. With Christmas approaching rapidly, I knew I needed allies and a foolproof strategy. The first person I recruited was my best friend since college, Chloe Liu, a brilliant computer security specialist whose expertise had saved multiple corporations from data breaches. Her quick mind and calm demeanor made her the perfect partner in this high-stakes situation. "So, your siblings are essentially embezzling from your family company and setting your dad up as the fall guy," Chloe summarized after I explained everything. "That's cold, even for the rich family drama I've come to expect from the Carters." "They've always been entitled, but this goes beyond anything I imagined," I admitted. "I need access to the company's current financial systems to document exactly what they're doing." Chloe nodded, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. "Legal access is preferable. Any credentials you can provide legitimately?" "Thanks to my mother's diary, I have several administrator passwords that might still work. Let's try these first," I said, handing her the list. To our surprise, one of the backup administrator accounts was still active. "Your mom was smart," Chloe commented as we gained access to the company's financial records. "She created this account with permissions that wouldn't show up on regular system audits." Over the next several days, Chloe helped me document countless suspicious transactions. James had diverted over $6 million to offshore accounts in the past year alone. Isabel had used company collateral to secure personal loans totaling $4 million. Ethan had written off his extravagant expenses as business entertainment and client development, despite having no actual role in the company. "We need someone on the inside," I realized. Someone with direct knowledge of daily operations. That person turned out to be Michael Hayes, a former financial controller who had been abruptly fired by James 6 months earlier. Nathan located him working at a much smaller firm across town. When I reached out, Michael was initially hesitant to meet. "The Carters have a lot of influence in this industry," he said nervously over the phone. "I can't afford to make enemies." "I'm not asking you to make enemies," I assured him. "Just to tell me the truth about why you were fired." We met at a quiet coffee shop far from the financial district. Michael, a meticulous man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair, kept checking the door as if expecting James to walk in. "I noticed irregular transactions. he finally explained. Large consulting fees to companies that didn't seem to do any actual consulting. Property acquisitions at inflated prices. When I raised concerns directly with James, he said it was part of a complex tax strategy and to mind my own business. But you didn't let it go, I guessed. Michael shook his head. I took my concerns to the head of accounting. 3 days later, James called me into his office, accused me of incompetence, and had security escort me out. The severance package came with an aggressive non-disclosure agreement, which you're violating by talking to me, I noted. The NDA had exceptions for legal investigations, Michael said with a hint of satisfaction. I made sure of that before signing. Are you planning legal action? I'm planning to stop them before they destroy the company, I replied. Would you be willing to provide documentation of what you found? Michael hesitated only briefly before nodding. I kept copies, against company policy, but I had a feeling I might need them someday. With Michael's documentation, we now had evidence spanning nearly 2 years of financial misconduct, but there was still a missing piece: current inside information. That came from an unexpected source. Priya Sharma, a junior accountant at Carter Real Estate Group, reached out to me through LinkedIn with a cryptic message. Regarding your family's company, there are things you should know. We met at her apartment, where she lived with 3 roommates in a cramped space that reminded me how privileged my own life had been. Priya was young, probably just out of college, with determination in her eyes despite her obvious nervousness. I process accounts payable, she explained. For the past several months, I've been instructed to code certain payments under categories that don't match what they're actually for. When I asked questions, my supervisor said it came from James directly and not to worry about it. Priya had kept her own records, meticulous notes of every suspicious transaction she'd been asked to process. I could lose my job for showing you this, she said, handing me a flash drive. But it doesn't feel right. With Priya, Michael, Chloe, Nathan, and Charles, I now had a small but powerful team. We gathered in Chloe's home office, which she had swept for surveillance devices just in case, to formulate our strategy. We have 3 objectives, I explained. First, document everything thoroughly. Second, secure the remaining assets before more damage can be done. And third, confront the situation in a way that allows for recovery with minimal public fallout. Nathan outlined the legal implications. There's enough here for criminal charges, but that would likely destroy the company's reputation and value, not to mention what it would do to your family. I nodded, thinking of my father's pride and my mother's legacy. The goal isn't punishment, it's correction and protection. Charles provided invaluable insight into the legal structures we could leverage. Your mother's foresight gives us options. With the voting rights attached to your shares, you can effectively block any major transactions they're planning. We developed a multi-stage plan. First, Chloe would monitor all financial systems to track ongoing activities. Michael would analyze the pattern of transactions to identify vulnerabilities. Priya would continue providing inside information while maintaining her cover. Nathan would prepare evidence packages for potential legal scenarios. Charles would quietly prepare the necessary legal documents to assert my rights under my mother's will. The final confrontation would occur at Christmas dinner, the one time each year when the entire family gathered without business associates or outside observers. It was a private setting where the truth could emerge without immediate public consequences. What if they deny everything? Chloe asked. They will, I acknowledged. That's why timing is crucial. We need to secure the accounts before the confrontation so they can't make emergency transfers once they realize what's happening. And your father? Charles asked gently. How do you think he'll react? I sighed, picturing my father's face, so confident in his understanding of his children and his business. He'll be angry at first, disbelieving. But Dad built this company from nothing. Once he sees the evidence, he'll care more about saving it than protecting those who betrayed him. In the days before Christmas, we finalized our preparations. Chloe set up a secure system that would allow me to initiate account freezes with a single text message. Charles prepared documents asserting my legal rights to intervene in company affairs. Nathan compiled a comprehensive evidence file, organized for maximum impact. I rehearsed what I would say, anticipating every possible reaction. There would be only one chance to do this right, to reveal the truth in a way that might ultimately save both the company and possibly even my family. The night before the confrontation, I visited my mother's grave. The December air was cold, the cemetery quiet under a light dusting of snow. "I hope I'm doing what you would want, Mom," I whispered, placing white roses on her headstone. Not for revenge, but for the right reasons. A sense of calm resolve settled over me as I drove back to my hotel. Tomorrow, everything would change. I was as ready as I could possibly be. I arrived at the family estate early on Christmas Day, my car crunching over the snow-covered driveway. The Georgian mansion looked like something from a holiday card, with professional decorations adorning every window and doorway. Perfect, polished, and completely artificial, just like our family gatherings. Maria, our longtime housekeeper, greeted me with a genuine smile that contrasted sharply with the manufactured cheer of the house. "Miss Abigail, so good to see you." Her warm hug was the first real thing I'd felt since arriving. "Merry Christmas, Maria. Is anyone else here yet?" "Your father is in his study. Mr. James and his family are in the East Wing. Miss Isabel just arrived about 20 minutes ago, and Mr. Ethan is still sleeping off whatever he did last night." She lowered her voice. "Your father has been in a strange mood all morning, very secretive with Mr. James." I thanked her for the information and made my way to the formal living room, where a 15-foot Christmas tree dominated the space, surrounded by perfectly wrapped presents that had been professionally arranged for maximum visual impact. Our family hadn't personally wrapped gifts for each other in years. Isabel entered, martini already in hand despite it being barely noon. Her designer dress probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, eyeing my simple but elegant outfit with obvious disapproval. "I thought you might skip this year, given how busy and important you are in Atlanta, and miss all this family warmth." "Never," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I noticed her checking her phone repeatedly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously against the screen. James and his wife Lauren appeared next, their children immediately running to the presents under the tree. James looked smug, a man who believed his position was secure and his future bright. He kept whispering something to Lauren, who would nod, and then glance at me with poorly disguised contempt. "Abigail," James acknowledged with a curt nod. "Surprised you could fit us into your schedule." "Family comes first, James. Mom taught me that." His jaw tightened at the mention of our mother. "Yes. Well, some of us demonstrate that commitment daily, not just at obligatory holiday gatherings." Ethan stumbled in around 1, looking hungover and disheveled despite his expensive clothes. "Hey, everybody's here. Merry Christmas, or whatever." He flopped onto the sofa, immediately reaching for his phone rather than engaging with anyone. Dad made his entrance last, commanding attention as always. At 64, William Carter still cut an imposing figure, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting the authority he had wielded his entire life. "Merry Christmas," he announced, his eyes surveying his children with varying degrees of approval. They lingered critically on me for a moment before moving on. The next few hours unfolded like a choreographed performance. We exchanged expensive gifts that had been selected by assistants. We made small talk about safe topics while avoiding anything meaningful. Lauren bragged about their children's private school achievements. Isabel mentioned her latest charity board position, conveniently omitting that she had donated nothing but attended all the galas. Ethan said almost nothing except to ask when dinner would be ready. I observed them all, noting the tension beneath the facade. James kept stepping out to make phone calls. Isabel checked her email, obsessively. Ethan seemed unusually subdued. Dad watched it all with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between satisfaction and suspicion. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at precisely 5:30. Maria and the catering staff had outdone themselves with a feast that would have fed 50 people rather than our small family of 8, including Lauren and the children. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the silver flatware gleamed against the fine china. We took our usual places, with Dad at the head of the table and James at the opposite end. I sat halfway down, directly across from Isabel, with Ethan to my right. Lauren managed the children, who were remarkably well behaved, probably due to threats of lost privileges rather than any natural inclination toward manners. Dad stood to offer a toast, raising his glass of 30-year-old scotch to family and to the future of Carter Real Estate Group. This coming year will bring significant changes that will secure our legacy for generations to come. The meaningful look he exchanged with James sent a chill down my spine. Whatever they were planning was imminent. The first course was served, and conversation remained superficial. Isabel discussed her recent trip to Vail. James mentioned a potential new development project in vague terms. Dad asked perfunctory questions about everyone's activities, except mine. "So, Abigail," Lauren finally said with false sweetness, "still working those long hours for someone else's company? Such a shame you never wanted to be part of the family business." Before I could respond, James jumped in. "Not everyone has what it takes to handle the responsibilities of Carter Real Estate. Some people prefer simpler challenges." Dad nodded in agreement. Different strengths, different paths. The condescension was nothing new, but knowing what I now knew about their activities, it took considerable restraint not to respond. As the main course was being cleared, I noticed James give a subtle nod to Dad. Isabel suddenly became very interested in her wine glass, while Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dad cleared his throat, setting down his napkin with deliberate precision. "Before dessert, I have an important announcement to make." The room fell silent. Even the children sensed the shift in atmosphere. "As you know, I've always believed in being direct," Dad began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in board meetings. "Family businesses require absolute loyalty and alignment of values." His gaze fixed on me. "It has come to my attention, Abigail, that you have been making inquiries about company operations, approaching former employees, and attempting to access restricted financial information." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. They had discovered some of my investigation, but clearly not the extent of it or what I had found. "Such actions can only be interpreted as hostile," Dad continued, "particularly when conducted secretly behind the backs of those who actually run the company." James was now openly smirking. Isabel had a small, satisfied smile playing at her lips. Ethan looked uncomfortable, but relieved that he wasn't the target of Dad's displeasure for once. "I've always given you freedom to pursue your own path, Abigail, but I cannot and will not tolerate subversive actions against this family's interests." Dad's voice hardened. "Therefore, effective immediately, you are disinherited from all Carter family assets, business interests, and future considerations." The words hung in the air. Though I had anticipated something like this, the public declaration still stung. Decades of dismissal and underestimation culminated in this moment of rejection. James reached over to high-five Isabel across the table. "Finally," he muttered. Isabel didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. "It's for the best, really. Abigail never understood our world anyway. Ethan gave a nervous laugh. Tough break, sis. Dad remained standing, expecting perhaps tears, protests, or pleas for reconsideration. Instead, I calmly picked up my wine glass, swirled the deep red liquid, and took a deliberate sip. The room grew uncomfortably silent as I set the glass down and looked directly into my father's eyes. "Check your bank account, Dad," I said quietly. Confusion crossed his face. "What?" "Your phone is right there." I nodded toward the device next to his plate, which he had been checking periodically throughout dinner. "Take a look at your primary account balance." Something in my tone must have concerned him because, instead of dismissing my suggestion, he picked up his phone and opened his banking app. I watched as his expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, then to horror. "This is impossible," he whispered, the color draining from his face. "It says zero. There should be over $12 million in this account." The silence in the room was absolute now. James's smirk vanished. Isabel sat up straight, alarm replacing her smugness. Ethan looked from Dad to me, clearly confused. "What have you done?" Dad demanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear. I set down my napkin and stood slowly. "I haven't done anything to your money, Dad. But I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who has." The dining room fell into stunned silence as Dad stared at his phone, frantically checking other accounts, only to find similar results. His face cycled through emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a creeping fear. "All the accounts," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Primary holdings, business reserves, even the offshore fund, all showing zero balances or frozen." James was the first to recover, his face reddening as he pointed an accusing finger at me. "What have you done? This is criminal. I always knew you were jealous, but this is beyond anything I imagined." I remained standing, calm in the face of his rage. "I haven't taken a penny, James. I've simply frozen the accounts temporarily to prevent any further unauthorized withdrawals, like the $2 million you were planning to transfer tomorrow morning to your personal account in the Bahamas." James's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Isabel grabbed her phone and began frantically checking something, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. "Dad, she's lying," James finally sputtered. "She's hacked the account somehow. We need to call the police." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick folder. "Before anyone calls the police, you might want to see what they'll find when they investigate." I opened the folder and began laying out documents on the table. Bank statements showing systematic withdrawals authorized by you, James, disguised as vendor payments, but actually directed to shell companies you control. James tried to grab the papers, but I moved them out of reach. "Then there's this," I continued, placing another set of documents on the table. "Isabel, these are the loan agreements where you used company property as collateral for personal loans totaling over $4 million, with no intention or means to repay them." Isabel's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. "Those were legitimate business expenses," she tried weakly. "For your 3 vacation homes and the yacht?" "I don't think so." I turned to Ethan, who was shrinking in his chair. "And Ethan, here are the falsified expense reports you submitted, claiming your gambling debts were business entertainment, $700,000 in the last year alone. Is this true?" Dad's voice was dangerously quiet as he looked at each of his children in turn. "Of course not," James exploded. "She's fabricated all of this to turn you against us. Abigail has always wanted control of the company. This is her play for power." I shook my head. "I don't want the company, James. I never have. But I won't stand by while you destroy what Dad and Mom built." I turned to my father. "They've been systematically looting the company for years, Dad. James has diverted over $6 million. Isabel has leveraged company assets for personal gain. Ethan has treated the business accounts like his personal ATM. You can't prove any of this, James insisted, though his confidence was clearly shaken. Actually, I can. Michael Hayes didn't leave the company because of incompetence. You fired him because he discovered your embezzlement scheme. I placed another document on the table. This is his sworn statement, along with the original reports he compiled before being terminated. James paled visibly. Michael was mistaken. The transactions were complex but legitimate. Then explain. These. I added a stack of financial records to the growing pile. Detailed evidence of money laundering through at least 12 shell companies. Priya Sharma in accounting has been documenting every suspicious transaction you've ordered processed. Isabel suddenly stood up, pointing at me with rage. You self-righteous. You had no right to investigate us or the company. You walked away years ago. I had every right, I replied calmly. More than you know. I nodded to Charles Mitchell, who had been waiting silently in the doorway. He stepped forward, carrying his own set of documents. Mr. Carter, Charles addressed my father formally. I believe it's time you were made aware of certain provisions in your late wife's will that you chose not to review in detail at the time of her passing. Dad looked bewildered. What are you talking about, Charles? We settled Margaret's estate years ago. Not entirely, sir. Charles adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Carter established a separate trust and appointed Abigail as executive with specific oversight powers regarding company operations. She was concerned about certain patterns she had observed. This is ridiculous, James interjected. Mom didn't know anything about the business operations. Charles fixed James with a stern look. On the contrary, Mrs. Carter was far more involved than you realized. She maintained detailed records, some of which documented your earliest attempts to misappropriate company funds. She chose not to confront you directly, but instead created safeguards. Dad looked shell-shocked. Margaret knew, and she didn't tell me? She tried, sir, Charles said gently. According to her private notes, she raised concerns several times, but you dismissed them as motherly overprotection. I stepped closer to my father. Mom left me 30% of the company's shares in a protected trust. Dad. Shares with special voting rights that activate under specific conditions, including suspected financial misconduct. That's impossible, Dad whispered. I would have known. It was in the will provisions you signed but didn't read completely, Charles confirmed. You were understandably distracted by grief at the time. James lunged for the legal documents, but Charles calmly moved them away. These are official copies, James. Destroying them won't change the legal reality. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Is it true, James? Have you been stealing from the company? From Dad? James rounded on him furiously. Shut up, Ethan, like you're innocent in all this, with your gambling and partying on company money. But that was different, Ethan protested weakly. You and Isabel said it was okay because we're family. You never said anything about offshore accounts and shell companies. Isabel shot Ethan a venomous look. Keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. The facade was crumbling as they turned on each other. Dad sat heavily in his chair, looking suddenly old and defeated. How much? He asked quietly. How much have they taken altogether? I met his eyes directly. Based on our forensic accounting, approximately $14 million over the past 5 years, accelerating significantly since Mom died. They've also put the company at risk for at least $20 million more in liability through Isabel's collateralized loans and James's fraudulent partnerships. Dad closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the magnitude of the betrayal. When he opened them, they were filled with a pain I had never seen before. Why? He asked, looking at James, Isabel, and Ethan in turn. We have everything, The company is successful. Your futures were secure. Why would you do this? None of them could hold his gaze. James stared at the table. Isabel examined her manicure. Ethan looked close to tears. Because they could, I answered for them. Because you gave them everything without expecting accountability. Because they never learned the value of what they had. Dad turned to me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. And you? Why did you do all this? After how I've treated you, why would you protect the company? Protect me? The question caught me off guard in the heat of the confrontation. I hadn't prepared for such vulnerability from my father. Because it was the right thing to do, I said simply. Because despite everything, this company is Mom's legacy too. And because hundreds of people depend on Carter real estate for their livelihoods, their families shouldn't suffer because of our family's dysfunction. Charles cleared his throat. There are decisions to be made, Mr. Carter. Legal and financial actions that can't wait. I've prepared some preliminary options for your consideration. Dad nodded slowly, the businessman in him reasserting itself through the personal devastation. Abigail, you said the accounts are frozen, not emptied. Yes. I worked with the banks to place temporary holds pending investigation of suspicious activities. No money has been lost yet, but there are transfers scheduled by James that would have gone through tomorrow. Can you prove that? Dad asked. I handed him a flash drive. Everything's here. Financial records, email trails, recorded conversations, witness statements. Enough evidence to bring criminal charges if that's what you decide. The word criminal hung in the air. James finally found his voice again. Dad, you can't seriously be considering legal action against your own children. Think of the scandal, the damage to the Carter name. The damage to the Carter name, Dad repeated slowly. That's your concern now? Not the theft? The lies? The betrayal? Isabel attempted a different approach. Daddy, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm sure if we sit down with the accountants, everything can be explained. The frozen accounts can't be explained away, Isabel, I countered. Neither can the documentation from multiple sources. Dad stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Everyone out except Abigail and Charles. I need to think. James started to protest, but Dad cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. Out. Now. We'll continue this discussion when I've reviewed the evidence and considered my options. As James, Isabel, and Ethan filed out, followed by Lauren hurriedly gathering the children, Dad turned to me. His expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been respect. All right, Abigail, he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. Show me everything. And Charles, I want to see that will again. Every last detail this time. The Christmas dinner had ended, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The following morning, we gathered in Dad's wood-paneled study. The Christmas tree lights blinked silently in the corner, a jarring reminder of the holiday that had been overshadowed by family crisis. Charles Mitchell sat at Dad's right, legal documents spread across the massive oak desk. I took the chair opposite while James, Isabel, and Ethan were positioned on the leather sofa against the wall, looking like defendants awaiting sentencing. No one had slept much. Dad's eyes were red-rimmed from what I suspected were hours reviewing the evidence I'd provided. He had always been thorough in business matters, and this situation was no exception. Despite the personal stakes, I've reviewed everything, Dad began, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion. The financial records, the witness statements, the legal documents from Margaret's will, and the additional evidence Abigail has gathered. He looked at each of his children in turn, his gaze hardening as it moved from me to my siblings. The evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. You have systematically abused your positions, violated my trust, and stolen from this family and this company. James leaned forward, still attempting damage control. Dad, you're not seeing the complete picture. Some of these transactions were complex investment strategies that— Stop. Dad's single word cut through the air like a knife. I built this company from nothing, James. Did you really think I wouldn't understand what you were doing once I saw the actual records? These weren't investment strategies. They were theft. Plain and simple. Isabel tried next, tears welling in her perfectly made-up eyes. Daddy, I never meant to cause harm. I just needed to maintain a certain lifestyle to network with the right people for business purposes. Dad's laugh was hollow. The right people? Like the 3 ex-husbands who are still on company health insurance? Or perhaps the interior design consultant who happens to be your personal shopper? Don't insult my intelligence, Isabel. Ethan at least had the decency to look genuinely ashamed. I screwed up, Dad. The gambling got out of control, and then I was in so deep I couldn't find a way out. Dad sighed heavily. At least that's honest, Ethan. But it doesn't excuse what you've done. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. Charles has outlined our options. Legally, I could press criminal charges against all 3 of you. The evidence would almost certainly lead to convictions and prison time. The color drained from James's face. Isabel gasped audibly. Ethan seemed to shrink further into the sofa. However, Dad continued, that would destroy this family completely and potentially the company as well. The scandal would be devastating for our business relationships and stock value. He turned back to face the room. So, we're going to handle this internally with strict conditions that will be legally binding. Charles has drafted the necessary documents. Charles nodded, pushing a stack of papers forward. These agreements outline the terms of restitution and future involvement with Carter Real Estate Group. They are non-negotiable. Dad resumed his seat. James, you're removed from all operational roles in the company, effective immediately. Your shares will be placed in a restricted trust that you cannot sell or transfer. You'll receive a greatly reduced annual income from those shares on the condition that you repay every dollar you've taken, with interest, over the next 10 years. James's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. I've given everything to this company. No, James. You've taken everything you could from this company, Dad corrected coldly. Be grateful you're not facing charges. The evidence Abigail gathered would put you away for at least 15 years. He turned to Isabel. Isabel, all company assets you've leveraged must be returned and liquidated to repay your debts. Your annual allowance is terminated. You'll receive a modest monthly stipend contingent on your active participation in legitimate community service, not just showing up at galas. Isabel opened her mouth to protest, but Dad silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. Ethan, Dad continued, his tone softening slightly, you will enter a serious treatment program for your gambling addiction. All your expenses will be monitored through a trust with Charles as executive. You'll work in the company's community outreach division at an entry-level position, earning your way up like any other employee. Ethan nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. Of the 3, he seemed to recognize that he was being offered a genuine chance at redemption. And if we refuse to sign? James challenged, his voice tight with suppressed fury. Dad's expression was implacable. Then Charles will deliver the evidence to the district attorney's office this afternoon, and you can explain your investment strategies to a jury. James glared at me with naked hatred. This is all your fault. You've manipulated Dad, just like you always manipulated Mom. I met his gaze steadily. Mom wasn't manipulated, James. She saw through you long before any of us did. That's why she put safeguards in place. Dad cleared his throat. Which brings me to the next point. In accordance with Margaret's will provisions that I regrettably overlooked, Abigail will assume the position of Chief Operating Officer of Carter Real Estate Group, with oversight of all financial operations. Her! James exploded. She hasn't even worked for the company. She doesn't know the first thing about our business. Dad fixed him with a withering stare. Abigail graduated summa cum laude in finance from Duke University. She spent the last decade building a stellar reputation in investment banking. And unlike you, she's never stolen a penny from anyone. I'd say she's eminently qualified. He turned to me, and I saw something I'd never expected to see in my father's eyes. Respect tinged with regret. That is, if she's willing to accept the position. The room fell silent as everyone turned to me. This was unexpected. In all my planning, I had never considered that I might be asked to take a leadership role in the company. I have a career in Atlanta, I said carefully. One I've built on my own merits. Dad nodded. I understand. But Carter Real Estate needs someone with integrity and financial acumen right now. Someone the employees and partners can trust. It doesn't have to be permanent if you don't want it to be, just long enough to right the ship. I thought about my mother's letter, her trust in me to protect what they had built together. I thought about the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's survival. I'll need complete autonomy in financial and operational decisions, I said, and a commitment to transparency going forward. Agreed, Dad said without hesitation. Whatever you need. Charles pushed the relevant paperwork forward, and I signed where indicated. James, Isabel, and Ethan followed suit. James with barely contained fury, Isabel with resigned bitterness, and Ethan with what seemed like genuine contrition. As Charles gathered the signed documents, Dad addressed my siblings one final time. You have a choice now. You can fight this and lose everything, or you can accept the consequences of your actions and begin to rebuild. Not just your financial positions, but your characters. His voice broke slightly. Your mother would have expected better from all of you. I should have too. With that, he dismissed them. As they filed out, Ethan paused beside me. I'm sorry, Abigail, he said quietly. Really, I never wanted things to get this bad. I nodded, acknowledging his apology without fully accepting it yet. Time would tell if he was sincere. When we were alone, Dad slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 64 years. I've been a fool, Abigail, blind to what was happening right under my nose, blind to who my children really are. He looked up at me, including you. We see what we want to see sometimes, I said, thinking of how long I had craved his approval despite knowing I would never receive it on his terms. Margaret saw clearly, he said softly. She always did. I should have listened to her about so many things. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a framed photograph I had never seen before. It showed my mother and me at my college graduation, both of us laughing, our faces alight with shared joy. She kept this on her desk, Dad said. She was so proud of you, not just your achievements, but the person you are. He set the photo down carefully. I was proud too, Abigail. I just didn't know how to show it when it didn't fit with my expectations. The admission stunned me. In all my life, I couldn't remember my father acknowledging that he might have been wrong about anything, let alone his treatment of me. We have a lot of work ahead, I said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. The company will need significant restructuring to recover from the damage. Dad nodded, accepting the shift. Where do we start? With a full forensic audit, I replied. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Then we'll need to reassure key clients and partners that the company is on solid footing going forward. As we began discussing the practical steps needed to save the company, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time, my father was treating me as an equal, valuing my expertise and perspective. It wasn't the relationship I had longed for as a child, but perhaps it was the beginning of something new and genuine, built on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. The road ahead would be challenging. Rebuilding the company's financial health would take time. Restructuring the family relationships, if possible at all, would take even longer. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about both. 1 year later, I stood at the window of what had once been my father's office and was now mine, watching snowflakes drift past the glass. The Christmas season had come around again, bringing with it both memories of last year's confrontation and reflection on all that had changed since that fateful dinner. Carter Real Estate Group had not only survived the crisis but was beginning to thrive again. The forensic audit had revealed even more financial misconduct than we initially discovered. But with transparent leadership and a commitment to ethical practices, we had managed to retain most clients and even attract new ones who valued our renewed integrity. Dad had stepped into a chairman emeritus role, offering guidance when asked, but largely leaving day-to-day operations to me. Our working relationship had evolved into something I never thought possible, built on mutual respect and honest communication. The personal relationship was still a work in progress, but there were moments of genuine connection that would have seemed impossible a year ago. James had fought the new arrangement every step of the way. He attempted legal challenges to the agreements he had signed, tried to turn board members against me, and even spread rumors among longtime clients. When those efforts failed, he finally left the city altogether, relocating to Oregon to start his own development company. Last I heard, he was struggling to gain traction without the Carter name and resources to rely on. Perhaps the necessity of building something on his own merit would eventually teach him what our parents had tried and failed to instill. Isabel's journey had been surprising. After initial resistance and resentment, the requirement to engage in actual community service rather than performative charity events had sparked an unexpected transformation. Working directly with families in need seemed to awaken something in her that had been buried beneath years of superficial pursuits. She would never be warm toward me, but she had found purpose beyond status and acquisition, and that seemed to be enough for now. Ethan had embraced his second chance with determination that impressed everyone. After completing an intensive treatment program for his gambling addiction, he had started in an entry-level position with our community development team and thrown himself into learning the business from the ground up. He still struggled at times, but he was building a life based on earned achievement rather than entitlement. Of all my siblings, he was the only one who regularly sought to repair our relationship, inviting me to lunch every few weeks to update me on his progress and ask about mine. As for me, I had discovered that leading the family company offered challenges and satisfactions I hadn't anticipated. The investment firm in Atlanta had been disappointed to lose me, but understood my decision. I had found that the knowledge and skills I'd developed there translated well to rebuilding Carter Real Estate, often in ways that brought fresh perspectives to long-standing practices. More importantly, I had found a balance between professional success and personal healing. The therapist I began seeing after last Christmas had helped me work through years of family dynamics and my own responses to them. I was learning to take pride in my accomplishments without seeking external validation, to set boundaries without building walls, and to forgive without forgetting the lessons of the past. Penny for your thoughts. Dad's voice broke through my reflection. He stood in the doorway, looking healthier than he had in years. Stepping back from the daily stress of running the company had allowed him to focus on his health, resulting in a man who looked younger than he had a year ago, despite the difficult journey. Just thinking about everything that's changed, I replied, gesturing for him to enter. He took a seat across from my desk in what had once been the visitor's chair to his own office. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "It's been quite a year," he acknowledged. "That's putting it mildly," I said with a small smile. Dad leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "I got the final report from the accountants today. All the diverted funds have been recovered or accounted for. The company is officially back on solid financial footing." "That's excellent news," I said, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. "Just in time for Christmas." "Speaking of which," Dad said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have something for you. I was going to wait until Christmas Day, but now seems right." He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a silver key on a simple chain. "What is this?" I asked, lifting it carefully. "The key to your mother's reading room," he explained. "I've had it locked since she passed. I couldn't bear to go in, but I couldn't bear to change it either. But it was her special place, and now I think it should be yours." I closed my hand around the key, emotion tightening my throat. Mom's reading room had been her sanctuary, the place where she retreated to think, read, and find peace. It was also where I had found her diary and the flash drive that had changed everything. "Thank you," I managed. "This means a lot." Dad nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Margaret would be proud of you, Abigail, not just for saving the company, but for how you've done it with integrity and compassion, even toward those who didn't deserve it." "I learned that from her," I said softly. "Yes, you did," he agreed. "And I'm trying to learn it now. Better late than never." He stood, seeming slightly uncomfortable with the emotional tenor of the conversation, old habits still not entirely broken. "Will you be at the house for dinner tomorrow night? Just a small gathering this year. Ethan and his sponsor, Isabel, if she can pull herself away from the shelter project." "I'll be there," I promised. After he left, I returned to the window, thinking about the journey from last Christmas to this one. The pain of that night had been necessary to lance a festering wound in our family, allowing genuine healing to begin. It hadn't been easy, and the process was far from complete. But there was progress that once would have seemed impossible. I thought about the lesson in it all, about how sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to finding what you truly needed. I had never sought to run the family company or to confront my family so directly. Yet facing those challenges had led to growth and possibilities I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. I had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means standing against those you love. That forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or enabling continued harm. That integrity, once compromised, is painfully difficult to rebuild, but the effort is worthwhile. And perhaps most importantly, that it's never too late to create a new definition of family based on mutual respect, rather than obligation or blood alone. As I slipped the key around my neck, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past year had been the most difficult and ultimately the most rewarding of my life. I had lost some things I thought were important, and gained others I hadn't known to value. I had discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, and vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself to feel. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters," I whispered to myself, echoing the wisdom my mother had tried to impart before her time ran out. The inheritance that truly mattered wasn't money, property, or even a company. It was the values she had lived by and tried to instill in all of us, values that had finally taken root, even in the rocky soil of our family's dysfunction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, watching the snow fall on the city my parents had built their dreams in, I was grateful for second chances and the opportunity to create something better from the ashes of what had been lost. Have you ever had to stand up against family to do what was right, or discovered that losing something you thought you wanted actually led to something better? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, And if this tale of family drama and redemption resonated with you, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories of overcoming betrayal, and share with someone who might need to be reminded that integrity matters more than appearances. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what's in the bank account, but the courage to face difficult truths.